Most men who farm the same ground for 3 decades develop a particular kind of stubbornness that looks from the outside like loyalty. They buy from the same dealer, they run the same brand, they sit in the same seat configuration season after season because it fits the shape of the work they do and the shape of the man doing it. And changing any part of it carries a cost that goes beyond money. It carries the cost of admitting that a different way might have worked just as well, or better, all along. For a farmer named Leonard Pruitt, that admission arrived not in a dramatic moment of mechanical failure or public embarrassment, but quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, in the form of a parts invoice that he read twice, set down on his desk, and stared at for a long time before he picked up the phone. Leonard ran just over 1,400 acres in the eastern part of a county that had seen its share of farm consolidation over the previous 20 years. The kind of slow compression where the smaller operations gradually disappear into the larger ones, and the equipment dealer networks contract along with them, leaving the farmers who remain doing business with fewer choices in a smaller geographic footprint than the one their fathers had navigated. He was 58 years old, had started farming full-time at 31, after a decade working as an equipment technician for a dealer 3 counties over, and had been running John Deere green since the first year he bought his own ground and his own machinery. He had, in that time, developed the kind of working knowledge of his equipment that comes from having spent years on the other side of the service desk, which meant he understood, better than most of his neighbors, exactly what a repair should cost and what it should take to do it correctly. That knowledge had made him, over 27 years, a more demanding customer than the average operator at his dealership, Meridian Equipment, a John Deere franchise that had served the county for 38 years and had gone through 2 ownership transitions since Leonard first walked through its doors. He asked questions at the service counter. He reviewed his work orders before authorizing labor. He knew enough about the mechanical systems on his machines to push back, occasionally, when a diagnosis didn't line up with what he was hearing from the equipment in the field. The service staff at Meridian had a mixed relationship with him as a result, respecting his knowledge while finding him, on certain days, less convenient to deal with than a customer who simply signed and left without questions. What Leonard had not done in 27 years was apply the same scrutiny to parts pricing that he applied to labor. It was a gap in his attention that he would later identify as the one the dealership had used most consistently, not through any deliberate scheme, so much as through the ordinary incentive structure of a business that makes more margin on parts than on any other part of the service transaction, and has little reason to call a customer's attention to how that margin has grown. The invoice that changed things was for a set of wear items on his primary tillage tractor: coulter blades, a set of scrapers, and a hardware kit for the toolbar, all of it routine replacement material that Leonard had bought from Meridian on a roughly annual cycle for the better part of a decade. He knew the category. He knew approximately what it should cost. He had bought the same general configuration of parts the previous spring and had the invoice somewhere in his files, and when the number on the new invoice landed in front of him that March afternoon, it was high enough relative to his memory of the previous year's purchase that he went looking for the old invoice before he authorized anything. He found it in the second drawer of his farm office filing cabinet, a little under 11 months old. He put the 2 invoices side by side on his desk and looked at them together. The difference was not a rounding error. The coulter blades alone had gone up 41% in 11 months. The scraper set was up 33%. The hardware kit, which was the least expensive item in the order and the one he'd expected to be most stable, had actually doubled in unit price. The combined total of the current invoice was 63% higher than the equivalent purchase from the previous spring for identical parts from the same manufacturer, bought at the same dealership 11 months apart. Leonard was an experienced enough operator to understand that parts prices increase. Steel costs go up, supply chains get disrupted, freight costs move around. He had watched prices across his operation increase year over year for most of his career and had built those increases into his planning accordingly. But 63% in 11 months was not a supply chain adjustment or a steel cost pass-through. It was something else, and he sat with the two invoices in front of him long enough that his wife came to the office door, saw the expression on his face, and asked without asking what was happening, in the way that a woman who has been married to a farmer for 30 years reads a situation without needing it explained. He told her the numbers. She looked at the invoices and said nothing for a moment, and then said that he should probably find out whether the parts were available somewhere else before he authorized the order. It was the same thing she might have said about any household purchase that had come in higher than expected. The straightforwardness of it cut through whatever inertia Leonard had been sitting in for the previous 20 minutes, and he picked up the phone. He did not call Meridian to question the invoice, not yet. He called a farmer named Bob Hartley, 2 townships north, who ran a similar tillage setup on comparable ground and who had about 2 years earlier quietly moved his parts purchasing away from the John Deere dealer network and toward a combination of aftermarket suppliers and a Massey Ferguson dealership that stocked compatible wear parts for multi-brand equipment. Leonard had heard about the change through the co-op, but had never asked Bob about it directly, partly because it hadn't seemed relevant to his own situation at the time, and partly because asking felt like the beginning of a conversation he wasn't sure he was ready to have. Bob picked up on the second ring and listened to Leonard describe the invoice comparison without interrupting. When Leonard finished, Bob was quiet for a second and then said that the numbers Leonard was describing weren't surprising to him, and that he'd seen something similar about 3 years before his own change, which was what had finally made him start looking at alternatives. He told Leonard to call Hartfield Ag, the Massey Ferguson dealer on the south end of the county, and ask to speak to their parts counter about compatible wear items for his tillage setup. He said to have his part numbers ready and to ask for a written quote before he agreed to anything, and to compare what he got back to the Meridian invoice he was holding. Leonard called Hartfield that same afternoon. He spoke to a parts manager named Curtis Healy, who had been working the counter there for 14 years, and who, when Leonard gave him the part numbers and described the application, confirmed availability on most of the items either from direct stock or from a 2-day order. The quote Curtis gave him, once he'd checked availability on each line item, came to just under 40% less than the Meridian invoice for the equivalent components, using a combination of OEM-compatible aftermarket parts and direct stock on the hardware items. Leonard wrote the number down on the same legal pad where he'd been comparing the 2 Meridian invoices. He stared at the 3 numbers for a while, the old Meridian price, the new Meridian price, and the Hartfield quote, arranged in a column that told a story he didn't enjoy reading. He called Meridian the next morning. He asked the parts manager directly whether the price increase on the coulter blades and scraper set was a permanent adjustment or a temporary supply situation, and whether there was any flexibility on the current quote given his history as a customer. The parts manager, a younger man who had been at Meridian for about 18 months and did not have a long relationship with Leonard specifically, checked with someone and came back with a number that was 5% lower than the original invoice and was presented as a loyalty accommodation, which was the phrase used, loyalty accommodation, as though a 5% reduction on a 63% increase represented something a 27-year customer should find meaningful. Leonard thanked him and said he'd call back with a decision by end of day. He did not call back by end of day. He called Curtis Healy at Hartfield instead and placed the order. He did not make any announcement about what he was doing or why. He simply ordered the parts from the place that had quoted him a fair price, the way any rational economic actor is supposed to behave, and the way Leonard, with his background as a former equipment technician, had always prided himself on being. But sitting with what he'd found over the previous 48 hours, he recognized that he had not, in fact, been behaving as a rational economic actor in the parts category for some years. He had been behaving as a loyal customer in a market where loyalty had been quietly monetized, in small increments across many invoices over many seasons, in a way that added up to a number he hadn't thought to calculate until a single comparison forced the calculation on him. He went back through his Meridian parts invoices for the previous 5 years that same week, pulling them from his files and entering the totals into a spreadsheet. He wasn't trying to build a legal case or a formal complaint. He was trying to understand the actual shape of what had happened, because he was the kind of man who found it easier to make decisions when the data behind them was visible and organized, rather than spread across a pile of paper he hadn't examined carefully enough. What the spreadsheet showed, once he'd worked through 5 years of invoices, was a parts spend that had increased at a rate considerably faster than inflation, faster than steel cost indexes, and faster than the general equipment cost environment he'd been tracking for his own budget planning purposes. The increase was not uniform across all categories, which is what made it hard to notice invoice by invoice. The way a pattern that varies in its specific expression is always harder to detect than a simple across-the-board adjustment that announces itself. Some items had held relatively stable, others had moved sharply. The net effect across 5 years was a parts spend considerably higher than the equivalent categories would have cost at prices consistent with the regional aftermarket. The number he arrived at, which he recognized was an approximation and not an audit, was large enough that he sat with the spreadsheet for a long time before he decided what to do with it. He did not feel, primarily, angry. He felt something closer to the particular tiredness of a man who has discovered that a mistake he could have caught earlier was allowed to run longer than it should have because he wasn't paying the right kind of attention. He moved his parts purchasing to Hartfield gradually over the following 2 seasons, category by category, as he worked through the comparison on each type of wear item he ordered regularly. Not everything was cheaper at Hartfield or through the aftermarket suppliers Curtis Healy recommended. Some items were priced comparably. A few were actually slightly higher. But across the full range of what Leonard bought in a typical operating year, the Hartfield relationship was meaningfully more economical. And Curtis, who had been doing this long enough to know the difference between a customer shopping on price and a customer evaluating a long-term relationship, gave Leonard the kind of detailed, technically informed parts counter service that Leonard's background as a former technician made him particularly equipped to appreciate. The equipment purchase conversation started later, and it started slowly. The way a significant decision starts for a man like Leonard, not with a sudden commitment, but with a series of questions asked over time, information gathered without urgency, and a gradual accumulation of reasons that eventually outweighs the accumulated inertia of 27 years pointing in a different direction. He test drove a Massey Ferguson 8S at a regional demo event that fall, invited by Karen Steltz, the sales manager at Hartfield, who had heard from Curtis that Leonard was worth a longer conversation. He drove it the way a former equipment technician drives a machine, which is to say carefully and with attention to things that most buyers don't specifically evaluate, listening to the hydraulics under load, feeling the transmission behavior at the shift points, paying attention to the cab ergonomics, not as comfort features, but as indicators of how the machine had been engineered to interact with the person running it across a 12-hour field day. He drove it for about 40 minutes and came back to the lot and told Karen it was a well-built machine, which in Leonard's vocabulary was a significant statement, and Karen, who had been in the business long enough to read a customer accurately, understood it as such. She didn't push. She gave him the spec sheet, gave him the service contact for the 2 operations in the county that were running the same model, and told him she'd be available when he was ready to talk further. He was ready 11 weeks later, after calling both of the reference operations and spending an afternoon with one of them walking through their service history on the machine in enough detail that Leonard came away with a clear picture of what the real-world ownership experience looked like across several seasons of hard use. He bought the 8S the following spring, traded his primary John Deere tractor as part of the transaction, and drove the Massey Ferguson home on an April morning that was unremarkable in every external sense, and felt, to Leonard, like the end of a very long argument he'd been having with himself about whether 27 years of doing something one way was a reason to keep doing it. It was not, he had decided, a sufficient reason. It had never been, he suspected, a sufficient reason. It had simply been the reason available when he wasn't asking for a better one, and it had served that purpose adequately, right up until the moment a parts invoice made asking unavoidable. Meridian Equipment did not lose Leonard's account entirely, at least not immediately. He continued to buy certain specialized parts through them when the availability or lead time made it the practical choice, and he brought one of his secondary machines in for a warranty-related service that Hartfield couldn't handle given the brand involved. But the center of gravity of his business, the annual parts spend, the equipment renewal cycle, the service relationship he trusted on his critical machines, all of it had moved. And the move was permanent in the way that decisions are permanent when they're made after a long, careful accumulation of evidence, rather than in a single emotional moment that might later be reconsidered. He mentioned the invoice comparison to 4 or 5 other farmers in the county over the following year, each time in the context of a genuine conversation rather than a campaign, each time with the actual numbers available if the other person wanted to see them. 2 of those farmers ran their own comparisons afterward. One of them moved his parts purchasing within the season. The other stayed with his existing dealer, but renegotiated his terms in a conversation that would not have happened without the context Leonard had given him, and came away with pricing that was meaningfully different from what he'd been accepting before. None of it made the county paper. None of it was the kind of story that announces itself while it's happening. It was just information shared between people who trusted each other, doing what accurate information does when it reaches people who are willing to act on it. Moving quietly in the direction of the better number, the way water moves when you stop holding it in the wrong place. The parts invoice that started it is still in Leonard's filing cabinet. Second drawer, in the folder with the previous year's equivalent purchase, the 2 documents side by side the way he left them on his desk that Tuesday afternoon in March. He doesn't look at them often. He doesn't need to. He did what they told him to do, which was the only thing a man who spent 27 years paying closer attention to everything else could reasonably do once the number in front of him became too clear to look away from. Bob Hartley, the neighbor who had taken Leonard's original call and pointed him toward Hartfield, heard about the equipment purchase through the co-op grapevine a few weeks after it happened. He called Leonard that evening, not to say anything in particular, just to check in the way neighbors check in when something significant has shifted in a farming operation they've been watching from nearby for a long time. They talked for a while about the spring planting schedule, about the price outlook, about a drainage project on the shared tile line between their properties that had been on both their lists for 2 seasons. At the end of the call, Bob asked how the new tractor was running, and Leonard said it was running well, better than he'd expected in a couple of specific areas he'd been skeptical about before the purchase. Bob said that was good to hear, and that was about the extent of it, because neither of them was the kind of man who required much ceremony around a decision that had already been made and was already proving itself out in the field. They hung up and went back to their evenings, and the next morning Leonard was in the cab of a machine that still had the new smell to it, running the first real work passes of the season across ground he had farmed for 27 years in equipment painted a different color. The ground didn't notice the difference. The work was the same work. The calendar moved the same way it always moved, pressing a man forward from one operation to the next without much patience for sentiment or reflection. Leonard noticed the difference in the cab, in the hydraulic response, in a few ergonomic details that his technician's background made him track more precisely than most operators would, and he made notes about them the way he made notes about everything mechanical that was new to him, systematically, without drama, building the kind of working knowledge of a machine that only comes from running it through a full season's range of conditions. By the end of that first season, he knew the machine well enough that the newness had worn off, and what remained was a straightforward assessment. It was a well-built tractor that did its job reliably, maintained competently by a dealer whose parts pricing and service responsiveness were consistent with what he had experienced in the purchasing process. That was, in Leonard's accounting, exactly what a piece of equipment was supposed to be, and exactly what a dealer relationship was supposed to provide. Not a revelation, and not a disappointment. Just a machine doing what a machine is supposed to do, supported by a dealer doing what a dealer is supposed to do, at prices that reflected what the work actually cost, without the additional margin that 27 years of unexamined loyalty had been quietly subsidizing. He renewed the Hartfield relationship the following spring with a second equipment purchase, a smaller utility tractor that his existing fleet had needed for a couple of seasons. The transaction was simpler than the first one and went more quickly, because by then both sides of it understood what the other expected, and there was no longer anything to establish. That is what a functional dealer relationship looks like once the noise of the initial comparison is over and the real terms of the ongoing business have settled into place.